Good morning, U.S. history students. Today we're going to continue to work on immigration, migration, and urbanization, but today is a deeper dive into the problems of urbanization. The unit question remains, how did immigration, internal migration, and urbanization transform American life? But we are going to look at the rapid growth of cities and how it forced people to contend with problems of housing, transportation, water, and sanitation. So you have your guide that you will be using. I should put a picture of it on here, but I forgot. But we are at Module 1B.3, the problems of urbanization. In the last two lessons, you learned about the arrival of millions of immigrants to America's shores and the relocation of African Americans to northern and Midwestern cities. In this lesson, we'll take a deeper dive on about how cities encounter challenges due to the growing urban population. This also builds upon our Unit 1A, particularly 1A2, when we looked at the concept of urbanization, which was the movement of people from the country or farms or rural areas to cities or urban areas. It also is going to build upon some of the problems of industrialization that we investigated in 1A4. We looked at problems that workers faced, and one of those problems were poor living conditions. So we're going to do a deeper dive into how these living conditions were problematic. So what you'll do now is you'll take a look at your vocabulary preview. This is slide 3. Hit pause and try to match the description on your guide to the descriptions here. They won't be exactly worded the same, but this is a practice in being able to identify elements in words that are synonyms and be able to transfer the knowledge that you have of these terms. So hit pause. All right, welcome back. So now we're going to take a look at things, just again, a quick recap. In Module 1B1, you learned about the immigrants and that they settled into jobs in the city, mostly in cities in the Northeast and Midwest. By 1910, immigrants are more than half the population of 18 major American cities, and many settled in neighborhoods with others from their native land. Why did people move to cities? This is your first question on your guide. And in this module, I did go ahead and make sure that you have in bold some indication of what you should write down. So on your guide, why did people move to cities? They moved there for jobs in factories and in businesses. They also moved there because it was the cheapest and most convenient place to live. What was the result? It was urbanization, or the growth of cities. So, building upon why people moved to cities, we know that there were many immigrants, and in order to help immigrants, the Americanization movement took shape. So, newcomers to the United States learned about their new country through this movement called the Americanization movement. And what was this movement? It was a movement in which schools taught immigrants English, American history, and government. Why did they do that? Because it helped them take their naturalization test and become U.S. citizens. Now we're going to take a look at what groups moved to cities. We already know from Module 1 that immigrants moved to cities. Why do they move to cities? Because cities offered unskilled labor, steady jobs in mills and factories. That kind of blocks it off. So they came for the work. But by 1890, there were twice as many Irish residents in New York City as there were in Dublin, Ireland. And by 1910, immigrant families made up more than half the total population of 18 major cities in the United States. So that's a pretty big immigrant population. Another group that settled into cities were farmers, and we know this from looking at our module earlier on in the last unit in 1A2. So farmers moved to cities because machines replaced the workers, and therefore unemployed farm workers moved to the cities to find jobs. Who else moved to cities? As we looked in the last module on discrimination, segregation, and migration, African Americans moved to cities. So many of the Southern farmers lost their jobs, were African Americans. Between 1890 and 1910, about 200,000 African Americans moved from the South to cities in the North. We're going to see that number go up to about 700,000 by the 1970s. So the Great Migration was not a short burst. There were bursts over time, because we're going to see this number again increase around the time of World War I, which comes, right around 1910, and then increase through the 1930s also. So why did they leave the South? Why did they come to the North? They were hoping to escape poverty and racial violence. And in your last module, you did take a look at Ida B. Wells, and she particularly wrote about lynching, and she was an anti-lynching advocate. And lynching was a way to control African Americans in the South through fear of being violently assaulted, even if you did nothing wrong. So it was a way to keep African Americans in, quote unquote, their place in the South. That fear drove many African Americans north, where lynching was more rare and not kind of the way of the land. However, they still found low wages in the North, and they still found prejudice. It just wasn't as bad. Some things that were also attractive about the cities were that they offered many economic opportunities, and they also provided so many cultural attractions. So moving picture shows, baseball became a pastime, Wild West shows. So there was lots of entertainment. And as labor unions start to take hold and people are not forced to work every waking hour, there was some more time for leisure. And because people had a little bit more pocket money, they had some money to spend. Not a ton, but the working poor were able to actually partake in some entertainment. So now we're going to talk about the problems that city dwellers faced. The first problem that we're looking at are the lack of living spaces and a housing shortage. City populations grew rapidly, and this led to many problems. Many of them moved into single-family houses. Sometimes 3 or 4 families lived in one house, and these houses became very overcrowded and unsanitary. So new types of houses were built in response to this problem. First of all, you have a row house, which is a single dwelling house that shares walls with other houses. And the problem was these were so overcrowded because multiple families would live there, even though it was supposed to be for one family. New York City then passed a law that required improved plumbing and airflow in buildings. So what resulted was a new style house called a dumbbell tenement, and it looked like a dumbbell. So a dumbbell is like a weight that you work out with, and that means that they were shaped like this, like a dumbbell. So like if you were working out, these would be the weights. There's the bar, okay? So these were long, narrow 5 or 6-story buildings that were shaped like barbells, and they contained these air shafts for better airflow. So that was the solution to the housing problem, but they weren't great solutions because garbage at the building was not picked up often. People began to dump it in the air shafts, so the areas in between the building, which attracted rats. So soon these dumbbell tenements became worse places to live than single-family houses. So it didn't really solve the problem. It helped marginally. Another problem was transportation. The growing population of cities created this problem. So the roads were not ready to accommodate moving large numbers of people. So planners developed new transit systems to carry large numbers of people. So this included the electric streetcar and the electric subway. And this did help the issue. It did help people move around the city, It, cut down on, pollution in the streets and, things like horse manure in the streets or dead horses in the street. So it was a cleaner way and a way to move people that was a bit more tidy and took away from the congestion on the streets. Another issue was water. Cities also faced problems of supplying enough clean, safe water to everyone. There was typically no indoor plumbing. They collected water from pails and faucets on the street. They would have to heat it for bathing. So you can imagine heating a bucket or two at a time, like warm baths were probably hard to come by, which probably led to the city still smelling pretty bad. Cholera and typhoid were problems. These are illnesses that come from unsafe drinking water. They can be deadly. So it was nothing, nothing to be sniffed at. It was a true problem and had a mortality rate to it. So the response to the problem was filtration was introduced in the 1870s and then chlorination I think that says the 1890s. And it made water safer for people to drink and use. So that did help the problem. Over time, it gets even better, but it did help the problem. Sanitation was always a problem. As the cities grew, so did the challenge of keeping them clean. Horse manure piled up in the streets, sewage flowed through the open gutters, and factories spewed out foul smoke into the air. People dumped their garbage in the streets, and it wasn't unusual to see a dead horse in the street. So, in response to the problem, we have a development of sewer lines and then creating a sanitation department. The sanitation department would be like your modern day garbage collectors. So you see them collecting garbage here. So this helped, but it was really still a challenge to keep the cities safe and clean. Fire was also a problem. The limited water supply in many cities contributed to another menace, which was fires. Major fires occurred in almost every large American city during the 1870s and 1880s. In addition to lacking water, which you needed to, get to put out a fire, most cities were packed with dwellings made of wood, which were like kindling waiting to be ignited. Things went up in flames when, the more wood you have. We know how fires are built. And then also using candles and kerosene heaters posed a fire hazard in dwellings or even in factories. So at first, most city firefighters were volunteers and they weren't always able to or available when they were needed. In Cincinnati, Ohio, they have the first paid fire department in 1853. By 1900, most cities had full-time professional fire departments. And then also the introduction of the automatic fire sprinkler and the replacement of building materials such as brick, stone, and concrete instead of wood helped to combat fire hazards. Crime was also a problem, crowded cities and sticky fingers. So things like shoplifting or pickpocketing. So petty thievery. So not huge, bank heists or anything like that, but just people stealing things. So in response to this, New York City organized their first police force in 1844, which helped with some of these petty crimes. But in most other cities, law enforcement units were too small to have much impact. And petty crimes are things that are easy to get away with. They're not high priority. So it helped, but it didn't help in a big way. And lastly, we're going to talk about the poor. The poor was a problem of the city, but there are a number of social reformers working to improve life in the cities. And one early reform program is the social gospel movement. And in this movement, it is a Christian movement, and the leaders preached that people reach salvation by helping the poor. So your salvation, your ability to get into heaven, to please God, was to help the poor. So many of these reformers responded to this calling and they established what are called settlement houses. These were community centers that were located in slum neighborhoods or poor neighborhoods, and workers there helped to provide friendship and other services to immigrants in particular or to the urban poor. So many of these houses were run by middle class, college educated women in particular. So this is going to be a little bit of a predecessor to the progressive movement that we're going to look at in the next unit. A lot of these themes are going to repeat. Settlement houses offered schooling, nursing, and other kinds of help. One of the most well known social reformers is Jane Addams of this time. She established Hull House in Chicago, and this focused on helping the poor of Chicago. And while this movement of the social gospel movement and helping the poor provided relief, it did not really solve the issue of poverty. If it did, we would not have poverty today, but it did help people who were suffering and needed services and help. All right, you've made it through the nuts and bolts of this lesson. And again, I hope that this was an easier lesson for you because you do already know so much about these concepts of urbanization and immigration. So now you're going to choose to do one of the following, but if you have time, you want to do both. Aspire to do both. There is a triangle shirtwaist fire and guide, which is attached to your viewing guide. So you watch the Ed puzzle, which is in Schoology in the 1B um, 3 folder. And then Jacob Reese, we'll learn about him a little later again. He was what was called a muckraker, meaning he exposed social ills and wrote about them. He was a journalist. And so this talks a little bit about the effects of urbanization and how the poor lived. So this is another Ed puzzle. They're both short. You have plenty of time to do both. But if you're running short on time, choose one. Okay? And I will leave you with a quick joke. Why did the raisin ask out the prune? Because he couldn't find a date. There you go. And I will see you in class. Thank you.